An administrator wants to check which user shut down a virtual machine within the past 14 days. Which Azure feature should be used? Correct answer, Azure Activity Log. Explanation: the Azure Activity Log captures control plane operations like starting, stopping, or deleting a VM, along with the user who performed them. It retains logs for 90 days, so 14 days is well within its range. Why the other options are incorrect: Azure Event Hubs, used for streaming event data, not auditing user actions. Azure Service Health, focuses on service outages and Azure issues, not user operations. Azure IAM, defines access permissions but doesn't log who actually performed an action. What is the best way to deploy a virtual machine to minimize outages caused by power failures? Correct answer, deploy in multiple availability zones. Explanation: availability zones are physically separate data centers within a region. Deploying across multiple zones ensures high availability and resilience against local failures such as power outages. Why the other options are incorrect: hybrid model, focuses on combining on-premises and cloud, not VM outage prevention. Edge zones, provide low latency services near users, not high availability. Multiple regions, provides disaster recovery but introduces higher cost and complexity compared to availability zones for this scenario. You need to enable asynchronous messaging to decouple application components. Which Azure storage service should be used? Correct answer, Azure Q. Explanation: Azure Q storage is designed for asynchronous message queuing, allowing distributed components to communicate reliably without tight coupling. Why the other options are incorrect: Azure Blobs, stores unstructured data like text, images, videos. Azure Files, provides shared file storage with SMB protocol, not messaging. Azure Disks, provides VM disk storage, not messaging. Which of the following is not considered a valid Azure data security practice? Correct answer, data compression. Explanation: data compression reduces file size but does not improve data security. Data encryption, segmentation, and destruction are standard practices in Azure data security. Why the other options are incorrect: data encryption, protects data from unauthorized access. Data segmentation, ensures data is logically separated for security. Data destruction, prevents recovery of sensitive data after use. A company is calculating current data center costs before migrating to Azure. Which of these is not an operational expenditure? Correct answer, building construction cost. Explanation: building construction is a capital expenditure because it is a one-time long-term investment. OpEx includes recurring costs like electricity, cooling, and resource usage. Why the other options are incorrect? Electricity cost, recurring, operational cost. Cooling cost, recurring, operational cost. Resource cost, pay-as-you-go Azure service usage. Which Azure feature provides protection against distributed denial of service attacks? Correct answer, Azure Network Protection. Explanation, DDoS protection in Azure is part of network security, protecting applications from traffic overload attacks at the network level. Why the other options are incorrect, Azure Data Protection, secures data, not against DDoS. Azure Physical Security, secures physical data centers, not traffic-based attacks. Azure Infrastructure Protection, broadly covers Azure environment security, but DDoS is specifically handled at the network layer. Your company needs a remote work setup for employees using their personal devices. Which Azure service is best suited? Correct answer, Windows Virtual Desktop. Explanation, Windows Virtual Desktop allows employees to access a secure, cloud-hosted desktop environment from anywhere, ideal for remote work setups. Why the other options are incorrect, Azure App Services, for hosting web apps, not desktops. Azure Dedicated Host, provides physical servers for compliance needs, not remote desktop access. Azure Virtual Machine, provides single VM environments but not full virtual desktop solutions for large teams. Your company is working on a sensitive government project and cannot expose IT resources to the public internet. Which Azure service should be used? Correct answer, Azure Express Route. Explanation, Azure Express Route provides a private connection between on-premises networks and Azure data centers, bypassing the public internet, ideal for secure government projects. Why the other options are incorrect, Azure VPN Gateway, still uses encrypted tunnels over the internet, not fully private. Azure Firewall Manager, centralizes firewall management, not private connectivity. Azure Virtual Network, provides logical isolation but still requires Internet or Express Route for external connectivity. A financial institution wants to enable single sign-on across all its Azure-based apps. Which service should be used? Correct answer, Azure Active Directory. Explanation, Azure AD provides identity management, authentication, and SSO for users across Azure and SaaS applications. Why the other options are incorrect, Azure Resource Manager, manages Azure resources but not identities. Azure Policy, enforces compliance rules, not identity management. Azure App Configuration, centralized app settings management, not SSO. Which Azure service enables monitoring millions of IoT devices' health and telemetry using a UI-based dashboard? Correct answer, Azure IoT Central. Explanation, Azure IoT Central is a fully managed IoT SaaS solution that provides dashboards for monitoring device telemetry, health, and alerts at scale. Why the other options are incorrect, Azure IoT Hub, handles device-to-cloud communication but doesn't provide a full dashboard by default. Azure Sphere, provides secure IoT hardware and OS, not dashboards. Azure RTOS, real-time operating system for embedded devices, not monitoring platform. Which of the following Azure services cannot be considered a compliance tool? Correct answer, Azure Purview. Explanation, Azure Purview is a data governance and cataloging solution, not a compliance-specific tool. Compliance tools include Azure Blueprints, Trust Center, and Service Trust Portal. Why the other options are incorrect: Microsoft Trust Center provides compliance and security information. Microsoft Service Trust Center, portal for compliance reports and audit information. Azure Blueprints enforces compliance by deploying resources with policies. Your organization wants to implement role-based access control for team members. Which service should be used? Correct answer, Azure RBAC. Explanation, Azure RBAC, that is role-based access control, provides fine-grained access management for Azure resources, assigning roles based on least privilege. Why the other options are incorrect: Azure Policy enforces governance rules, not access roles. Azure ADSSO handles single sign-on, not role management. Azure ADDS provides domain services, not role-based authorization. An e-commerce site expects website traffic to double temporarily during New Year promotions. Which cloud property ensures uninterrupted performance in a cost-effective way? Correct answer, elasticity. Explanation, elasticity allows automatic scaling up or down of resources depending on demand, which is cost-effective for handling temporary spikes in traffic. Why the other options are incorrect: high availability ensures uptime but doesn't scale resources dynamically. Backup recovery helps restore data, not handle traffic spikes. Fault tolerance prevents system failure but doesn't adjust resources dynamically. You need to migrate a large on-prem SQL Server database into Azure with minimal code changes. What is the best option? Correct answer, Azure SQL Managed Instance. Explanation, Azure SQL Managed Instance offers near 100% compatibility with on-premises SQL Server, making migration seamless with minimal code changes. Why the other options are incorrect: Azure SQL Database requires more code changes due to limitations in compatibility. Azure Database Migration Service assists in migration but is not the destination itself. Azure SQL, general term, not a specific service. Which Azure service uses machine learning for faster and smarter threat detection? Correct answer, Azure Sentinel. Explanation, Azure Sentinel is a cloud-native SIEM tool that uses AI and machine learning to detect, investigate, and respond to threats. Why the other options are incorrect: Azure DDoS Protection prevents DDoS attacks but doesn't use ML for threat intelligence. Azure Firewall filters traffic but not ML-based. Azure Network Watcher monitors network performance, not threat detection. Azure China is a separate instance of Microsoft Azure Cloud Service located in China. Correct answer, physically. Explanation, Azure China is physically isolated from the global Azure infrastructure, operated independently under Chinese law. Why the other options are incorrect: logically/virtually/partially, do not represent the physical separation enforced by Azure China. Which Azure option provides a browser-based shell experience? Correct answer, Azure Cloud Shell. Explanation: Azure Cloud Shell is a browser-based command line interface providing access to Azure CLI and Azure PowerShell. Why the other options are incorrect: Azure CLI/Azure PowerShell, command line tools but not browser hosted. Which two Azure resources provide full scope control in Azure? Correct answer, Azure Blueprints, and Azure Policy. Explanation: Azure Blueprints deploys resources along with policies, RBAC, and templates for full control. Azure Policy ensures compliance by enforcing governance across resources. Why the other options are incorrect: Azure Trust Center provides compliance info, not control. Azure RBAC handles access, not full scope governance. Azure AD manages identity but not overall governance. Which service provides a traditional network-like experience in Azure? Correct answer, Azure VNet. Explanation: Azure Virtual Network provides a private network environment similar to an on-premises data center with additional Azure scalability. Why the other options are incorrect: Azure VPN Gateway connects networks but not a full private network environment. Azure DNS manages DNS records, not networks. Azure Orbital satellite communication, not private networking. You plan to use Azure Functions for business logic. Which two are valid Azure function triggers? Correct answer, Q trigger, and blob trigger. Explanation: Azure Functions can be triggered by various sources, including queue storage and blob storage. These enable serverless event-driven execution. Why the other options are incorrect: Web App Trigger, no such trigger exists. VM Trigger, no direct function trigger from VM state changes. Your company wants a service to quickly provision dev/test environments while minimizing waste with quotas and policies. Which service should you use? Correct answer, Azure Dev Test Labs. Explanation: Azure Dev Test Labs enables rapid provisioning of development and test environments with cost control via quotas and policies. Why the other options are incorrect: Azure DevOps, CI/CD pipelines, not environment provisioning. Azure Kubernetes manages containers, not dev/test VMS. Azure Event Grid handles event routing, not test environments. Your company wants to build, test, and deploy predictive analytics solutions. Which Azure service should be used? Correct answer, Azure Machine Learning Studio. Explanation: Azure ML Studio is designed to build, train, and deploy predictive models with AI/ML. Why the other options are incorrect: Azure Cosmos DB, no predictive modeling, only database. Azure Dev Test Labs, provides dev/test environments. Azure Logic Apps, automates workflows, not ML. Which service helps evaluate whether your company's Azure environment meets regulatory requirements? Correct answer: Microsoft Defender for Cloud. Explanation: Microsoft Defender for Cloud provides compliance assessments with built-in regulatory frameworks. Why the other options are incorrect: Azure Advisor gives cost and performance recommendations, not compliance. Azure Service Health tracks Azure outages, not compliance. Azure Knowledge Center, documentation, not compliance checks. How can you manage an on-premises Windows server as an Azure resource? Correct answer: Azure Arc. Explanation: Azure Arc extends Azure management to on-premises and multi-cloud resources, allowing an on-premises server to be managed as if it were in Azure. Why the other options are incorrect: Azure AD Connect syncs identities, not servers. Azure VPN Gateway connects networks, not server management. Azure Pipelines Agent for CI/CD, not server management. Complete the sentence. An organization that hosts its infrastructure in Azure no longer requires a data center. Correct answer: public cloud. Explanation: with a public cloud like Azure, infrastructure is fully hosted by the provider, eliminating the need for an on-premises data center. Why the other options are incorrect: private cloud still requires owning and managing hardware. Hybrid cloud still involves a data center component. Hyper-V host on-prem virtualization still requires physical infrastructure.